All right, so you just heard a little bit about who I am. So I'm just gonna add a little bit about the research elements of my practice and how I kind of approach those. I am fascinated. I'm reading Keaton's Transformation Now book, and I really like what she's saying about honesty and how honesty plays into the work and the research that we do. I really like that she's coming at it from the approach of, listen, let's stop with the post-pity, let's stop with the pity Olympics. Let's stop with the who is more oppressed, who has had more struggle, Let's just work for social justice. That really speaks to me, and I think that is important. She's calling for a space of growth, a space of development, and she's calling for that from the perspective of the individual. So what I usually refer to as I work. And I think that I work is very important as well when we're thinking and talking about different ways of practicing and different ways of engaging with the university. I also want to say that I come to my work as an intellectual. I think I'm more of an intellectual than an academic from the Caribbean intellectual tradition. And I am going to allow you to ask me the question shortly, why do I have to care about the Caribbean intellectual tradition? I'm up here practicing in Canada. What does that have to do with me? I'm hopefully going to tie that together shortly. The Caribbean intellectual tradition is anti-colonial, it is transdisciplinary, it is praxis-based, and I want to say that it started way before, of course, the 1930s, but the institutionalization of it starts in the late 1930s, 1940s. The University of the West Indies opens in about 1948, University of Guyana 1952. And the reason why I'm saying that is because there are some people who believe that transdisciplinarity is a buzzword. It's new. This is what we're doing now. Absolutely not. And while transdisciplinarity is something that we are trying to find space for within the Western Academy, in the Caribbean intellectual tradition, transdisciplinarity is actually the norm. There are more of us that practice that way than practice within a disciplinary kind of confine. So I think that is important to say as well. And finally, on this slide, I want to make the point that the way that I do my work is around safe space. So I want to create safe space for students, for researchers, you know, just for people to interact, for people, like I said, to do these things, to be honest, to think about growth, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think you can do all of this in a space that does not allow for it. Okay, so that's also very important in kind of how I set up my approach to research and teaching and that kind of thing. So what I want to do today, if I'm successful, I want to think and talk about transdisciplinarity, particularly in the context of the Caribbean intellectual tradition. That is the one that I know best, but I'm not only talking about it because it's the one that I know best. I think there are particular lessons that we can take away as we think and talk about transdisciplinarity in this age, as well as the connection between transdisciplinarity and equity, diversity and inclusion, and indigeneity and accessibility. I think there are some kernels of lessons in there. I like to define things because we often in academic spaces speak as if everybody knows what we're talking about. And I think that there are multiple ways to define, you know, kind of the same word or the same approach in the academy. And so I like to be very clear. Here's what I'm talking about. When I use this word, here is what I mean. And then I want to talk, of course, about the Manufactured Ecosystems Project, which is a very cool project that I've been engaged in at this university over the last couple of weeks, months. And I want to hold it up as one of those projects that is really doing transdisciplinary research well. And we'll get to talk about that a little bit as well today. So when we're thinking about transdisciplinarity, I think we're thinking about research culture, right? We talk a lot about the environment of the university, the student experience and that kind of thing. The university also has a research culture. How do we do what we do? Why do we do what we do? How do we set up the spaces that we work in? Who is in those spaces? Who is excluded from those spaces? How do we review those spaces? I think this is kind of a less spoken about or thought about aspect of the university. Now, if we're talking about the Western university, I want to suggest that there is an aspect of that Western research culture that is tied to colonialism. I want to suggest that. And I'm looking at this passage here that talks about, it may be too small for you to see, and I apologize for that, but we're looking at one of the first research labs, which was on board a ship that used to do slaving, right? And the writer here, who is Kathleen Wilson, is talking about how that lab was set up and how they approached research. So that very much is one of the things that we have to think about and talk about. We say, oh, well, we work in a Western institution, right? And there are some of us that know and understand what that means, and there's some of us like, oh, we work in a Western institution. But really what that is an institution that is tied to a particular understanding, a particular manifestation of race, of diversity, or non-diversity, of colonialism, of capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that I want to highlight about this slide is, where am I finding the information, right? I'm not finding this information in any book about a university or anything. I'm reading about gender, right? I'm reading about the construction of the slave society. And this information is popping out at me, which of course is one of the benefits of transdisciplinary research. In order to get a full picture of any one thing, we have to be willing to look beyond those traditional boundaries. Right? So I'm signaling that right here, right now. So what is knowledge hegemony? What am I talking about when I'm talking about that? A very important part of the colonial enterprise is the construction of hierarchies of difference. So we have the racial hierarchy of difference, the gendered hierarchy of difference, class hierarchies of difference. At that time, it would have been more around economic hierarchies, who did which job, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that now these hierarchies give us this society that we have, where there are certain types of populations that are seen as deserving, undeserving, good, not good, desirable, undesirable, better than, less than, all of the words that we use to enforce that kind of hierarchical understanding of our world. I think what we think about less is what upholds those hierarchies, and the connection between knowledge and the way that we construct knowledge and the way that we continue to feed those hierarchies. They don't exist just like out of the blue, right? They're fed by an intellectual project. And that intellectual project is actually a critical aspect of the making of the colonial system. So if you read the work of Orlando Patterson, I will get to it shortly, he's talking and thinking about slavery across the world, not just the transatlantic enterprise, but the construction of the slave system, which is present in a number of societies all over the world. And he says that one of the major tools of slavery is always to dehumanize people. And dehumanization is done partly through a knowledge project. Who knows? Who does not know? Who is civilized? Who is not civilized? Right? We also construct grand narratives. And grand narratives hold the keys to who is seen, who is understood, who is not seen, not understood, etc., etc. So grand narratives are a very important aspect of the whole enterprise of shaping this world that we have, that is characterized by, discrimination, social injustices, so on and so forth. Whose knowledge is validated? So when we talk about the Western Academy takes its knowledge, its approach to making knowledge, et cetera, very much from the Western traditions, right? How do we think about science? How do we talk about science? Who is studied by science, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this, again, is one that people don't think about a lot. How do we access information? What gets printed? What gets published? I think we pick up an academic book and we're just like, oh, this is lovely. Look at this book. Like if everybody has across the world equal access to that printing ability, and everybody doesn't. There are some traditions that do, and there are some traditions that don't, okay? So all of this is how we create knowledge hegemony. All of this is what it is. So remember I said I'm gonna give you the opportunity to ask me, why should I care about the Caribbean? What does that have to do with anything? Well, if we are unraveling this project of modernity that we have now, if we're thinking about different ways of constructing the world, creating the world, the truth is, a lot of how our world is constructed now actually happens in the Caribbean. Because the Caribbean is the seat of economic power in the proto-capitalist society. And where power is where knowledge also comes from and is, right? So if you are trying to set up a narrative of why you should be able to go to parts of the world, create a slave system, benefit from the resources, etc., you're not going to use the knowledge of somebody else. You're going to use your knowledge, right? So to understand the project of modernity that we currently have, the Caribbean is actually not the periphery, it's actually the center, right? And I put it to you then that the Caribbean intellectual tradition becomes an important aspect in how do we make knowledge, how have we made knowledge, how do we deconstruct some of the grand narratives that we have been given and make space for different narratives. Now, I am not claiming that the Caribbean alone offers those answers. There are other traditions as well that we should read as importantly, but I'm just saying to you that there needs to be space beyond the Western intellectual tradition if we are going to find the answers that we need to fuel us doing research differently, thinking about knowledge making differently, etc., okay? So we have this idea, again, in the world that places like the Caribbean, the global South, they take knowledge from us, right? Like we create all the theories, and then we give them to these regions. And actually, if we think and talk about, you know, the Caribbean research that has been done in the Caribbean, but even, like I said, before we had the institutionalization of that research, the Caribbean was participating in a knowledge exchange, right? And if you read the work of, for example, Richard Alsop, when he talks about the writing of Shakespeare and how the writing of Shakespeare is influenced by the Caribbean. And I remember reading that the first time, and I read it like 3 times, and I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Like, you know what I mean? Because we are so accustomed to that one marketing. But what does knowledge hegemony exactly have to do with transdisciplinarity? Like, how are those two things connected? Because at the end of the day, I think, humbly, I'm suggesting to you that transdisciplinarity is one of the ways to deconstruct knowledge hegemony, right? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll be able to help you to at least agree or at least think about that a little more. So this is another piece, and again, I'm sorry if these are kind of a little small. I had trouble gauging how it would look on the big screen. But I spoke about Orlando Patterson, who is one of the foremost sociologists of the Caribbean Project, the Caribbean Society Project. He talks about slavery a lot and how it was constructed. But in the introduction of this book, he reflects on his own academic kind of tradition and where he comes from. And he talks about going into the new University College of the West Indies and being told that he has to do economics because he was bright. He had come on a scholarship and he wanted to do history. He was like, I want to do history. And people were like, you've got to be mad. Like, you're gonna do economics. But then he talks about having these lecturers who brought a lot of history into their economics. And he talks about how thankful he was because that was kind of his beginning of the transdisciplinary enterprise that has created what is a very well-respected career. He's now at Harvard University, has been at Harvard University for a very long time. So I'm just using this to say transdisciplinarity has been around. It is not a buzzword. It is not a George Floyd thing. It is not an EDI thing. It has been in this particular intellectual tradition for a very long time. And if we are looking at ways to do it well, and to do it right, then the Caribbean is replete with a whole set of individuals who have done this work over time and have been successful at doing it. So what is my kind of practice of transdisciplinary work? Although I was in this tradition, like I said, where this was the norm, it was not the exception. You know, like how when you live in something on a daily basis, nobody announces it to you. You just get up and that's what it is, right? Like nobody has to be at the door to say, this is a classroom. Welcome to this classroom, because we all know this is a classroom. Like this is a part of our reality. So I think my own kind of coming into transdisciplinary work was like that. Nobody told me that this is what I was doing. This was just research, right? And I remember being a master's student and hearing about, at the time my discipline was linguistics, and I was hearing about, you know, how linguistics was constructed in the Western tradition, and then in America, and then in England, and I was like, okay, we're gonna talk about the Caribbean next. Like somebody is gonna tell me what we do in the Caribbean around this discipline and how we end up studying what we study and what we don't and da-da-da. And it never came. And so I went to the library and I was like, okay, there must be a book that tells me about Caribbean linguistics and how to do it and why we do it and da-da-da. And I went and there was no book. And so I started to ask profs. I was like, where's the information on Caribbean linguistics? Like, I was at this university. I was very clear that what I was doing was linguistics, but there was no information, right? And so I was like, all right, that's what my PhD is going to be. Like, that's what I'm going to do. And I started to read the work of Figueroa on sociolinguistic meta-theory. Meta-theory is, how do we even study studies? How do we even think about a discipline? How do we even think about how it is set up? So pathobiology, okay, you're doing pathobiology. What does that mean? Where did it come from? Why is it important? Even before you start to study the themes and topics in it, what is it, right? That is the level that meta theory operates at. So I'm reading this book and I'm like, okay, I get this. And I go to apply the framework that she was using and it doesn't fit. Like so she's setting up the framework between Cartesian and Hegelian studies. Not going to go too far into that, but you can check it out, after this. And I'm like, okay, I'm lining up the linguists now that I'm trying to study in the Caribbean tradition. I'm like, okay, you go on the Hegelian side. Okay, you go on the Cartesian side. And I get to the third one and I'm like, well, this framework is not going to work, right? So then what do I do? What do I have to do? I have to find something different, which I'll talk about shortly on the next slide. But I also just wanted to say, in terms of how we are thinking and talking about science and what it is and how we have gotten to the practices that we practice or not or whatever, I also found Sandra Hardin, Science from Below, to be very helpful. And I read that way after my kind of PhD work. But I'm just saying that, there are books available that can help us to understand what are we even studying. I'm not talking about any of the topics that you would do from week to week. I'm talking about the overall enterprise. What is this that I'm doing? Where do I fit into it? And I want to put it to you that those are important questions for us to ask, again, if we want to do things differently, right? So kind of three of the things that just came out of this thesis that I thought were important and that stuck with me in this transdisciplinary work is that disciplines will change according to the geographic location, right? So sociolinguistics and America and what is happening in America and how that ends up changing language study when it moves from Europe into America. We talk and think about academic disciplines as if they're rigid, Okay, we do geography at this university, and what we do as geography is the same thing that somebody in Asia should do or India should do. Well, yes and no. There is a relationship, but there are also significant differences. And I think that those things sound simple to say, but those are the things that really turn how we approach our research. What we do, what we don't do, the questions that we see as valuable questions, questions that we don't see as valuable questions. So they sound simple, but they're absolutely not. So like I was saying, these disciplines will be connected and disconnected all at the same time, and that is normal, right? So what we are actually calling pathobiology, like I said, is you will see similarities if you go somewhere else, and you will see differences. But when we think and talk about knowledge and how we construct knowledge, that's not how we construct knowledge, is it? We think we come to the university and we learn the thing. We learn the thing. When we leave, we're an expert in the thing. Nah, right? And then all knowledge is embodied. All knowledge is political. All knowledge has bias. All knowledge is constructed within, like I said just now, those binaries that cause hierarchies, discrimination, etc., etc. So some people will say to me, no, I'm in STEM. We don't have any of that funny business about, these hierarchies and this. It's just information. Oh, what? We know the story of how they developed the discipline of gynecology, right? I hope so. And if we don't know, by the end of today, we will all know, and then we will know that science is just as laden with all of the things that we have to think about and talk about in all of the other disciplines, okay? Funding and space, again, is another thing that kept coming through my thesis. Who gets to publish? Where do they get to publish? I remember when I was finished my thesis, I was so proud with myself, and I said to my what do you call the person my supervisor at the time? I'm sorry, I was like, I found the perfect person to review my thesis. Like, there's this guy at Harvard who is doing all of this stuff, and he laughed at me, and I was like, what is going on? Like, why are you laughing? Like, I am serious. Like, I am telling you who I want to look at my work. He was like, you really think somebody from Harvard is going to look at your degree from here at the University of the Western Australia? I was like, yes, it's important and well done, and why wouldn't they do that? And again, it is just all of these ways that we don't think about knowledge as a commodity that is controlled by all of those divisions. So poor me, I had to go and get somebody from Puerto Rico who was more on the tier of the university from which I came. Well, wasn't that something? I'm still not happy about that, but these are the things when we think and we talk about research and how we're doing research, how we're approaching research. Who are your research, who are the people that you're going to collaborate going to be? Are you going to continue with this ranking of universities that says that, University of Guelph can't talk to I don't know who else, whatever, or are we going to change that? Should we change it? If we change it, how, why, when? All of these are questions that are important, right? And then the intellectual confidence. So I think although we have this tradition in the Caribbean that is very old, you hear about people like C.L.R. James and Walter Rodney, and you can just call off names, Franz Fanon, Amy Césaire, like you can just names. There are a lot of us who still lack the confidence to come and say, this is my work, this is how it is connected to this tradition, and this is how it is important, right? So intellectual confidence, when we go back to thinking about research culture, it's a thing. When you leave this university and you have a degree from the University of Guelph, you're proud about that. You stand firmly in that, and people understand and know what that means, right? You come from a university in the quote-unquote third world, not so much. You're still justifying yourself, your research, All of that is the hegemony and how it works, right? I'm just gonna quickly kind of gloss over this slide to say the problem that I introduced to you of how am I gonna set up this framework that actually makes sense for this thesis that I was writing. I had to step outside of linguistics altogether. Nothing there was working, and that was my first foray into transdisciplinary studies, which if I think of it now was a crazy thing to do as a PhD student. It's like it was a hugely crazy thing to do. But I went to intellectual history, and through intellectual history, I was able to analyze and talk about the Caribbean intellectual tradition with respect to linguistics the way that I wanted to do it. Now, the reason why that is crazy for a PhD student is because a PhD is where you show that you're the expert in an area. I certainly was not an expert in intellectual history. I was actually reading and teaching myself intellectual history and applying the framework, right? So my supervisor was very jittery, bless his soul, but we did it. And I think what happened is that I will probably never be the expert, but I filled an important research gap. We can now understand very clearly how Caribbean linguistics is constructed, and Caribbean linguistics is just a metaphor for the broader Caribbean intellectual tradition. And all of those kernels that I'm talking about in terms of how transdisciplinarity looks, the understanding of this proto-capitalist society, what it has given to us, how we can break down, some of the things that we don't want, replace them with other things. All of that kind of came out of the work that I did. So I'm never going to be the expert, but I'm happy that I moved beyond the discomfort to be able to try something else, right? Would I recommend students to do it? Absolutely not. But I'm comfortable that I did it. So what exactly is the problem with knowledge hegemony? Why is it not a good thing? Well, first of all, it makes us intellectually lazy. So we become the expert, we know a whole set about this thing and absolutely nothing else about any of the other things that are as related to that thing. So it makes us intellectually lazy. I will also say that there is a huge humility that comes with transdisciplinarity, exactly because you know that you are not the expert. Like, you have to be very humble. I'm doing this. I feel like I'm doing it right. Oh my gosh, I hope that I'm doing it right. But because you are not the expert, the approach to the way that you make knowledge is one that is a lot less boastful and all of the things that we can think about sometimes when we think about a person who sees themselves as an expert, right? So that humility is a good thing. Subjugation shows up in knowledge hegemony. And so what we do with those grand narratives is that we try to make grand narratives fit the entire world. The entire world, right? So we talk about, I don't know, the age of at which people do X and Y and Z, as if all people do it that way. So what we actually lose is some important kind of subgroups of people. And I put some examples here that I thought, were outside of the norms that we would think about. So those grand narratives in and of themselves cause subjugation, right? We have some very disembodied knowledge coming out of knowledge hegemony, right? So like I said before, what we think we know, we don't actually know. We just know a lot of this, but nothing that is connected to, right? So when we think and talk about domestic violence and the intersection between domestic violence and mental health, that is something that we're only now kind of, I think, unraveling and exploring, right? We weren't doing that way before, and we didn't even want, those two things didn't even talk at one point in time. It's so important. Now that they've started to talk, the way that we approach things, think about things, do research, do intervention programs is absolutely different. Right? So we're closing those gaps, right? Again, mental health, colonialism, generational trauma. How we're talking about those things now, completely different. Because the conversation is starting to move across those boundaries. Oh, well, we only look at this over here. We don't look at that over there. Like, we have to look at everything if we're really going to find solutions that work. Diabetes, illness, and slavery. So if you look at the work of Hilary Beckles talks about hypertension and diabetes as relics of the plantation. And there are other researchers too that point to other things that affect the Black community, and they tie it right back to plantation. I know that research is going on with the indigenous communities as well. So how we see what we see is different when we look across the disciplines, and that is absolutely important. And if you think about healthcare, I'm trying to draw some examples from healthcare, so that we can start to think and talk about, okay, what is the solution that we're actually looking for, and how do we set up the problem, right, as we get on our way to that solution. If we have knowledge hegemony, then the system fails. We have all these system failures. We're like, oh my goodness, but education is a problem in the Caribbean. It's a real problem. Why is that? Well, you're teaching children about snow that they've never seen. You're teaching them about all kinds of animals that they've never seen. I wonder why they don't understand. Systems fail when we only coming to the system from a particular perspective, a particular understanding of our world, right? So I'm thinking that stronger connections can make our systems work better, right? That's what I'm thinking. So now that I've set up all of kind of, okay, what are some of the struggles? What are some of the issues? We can think about transdisciplinarity as a way to fix, hopefully, I suggest, some of those issues. So I just want to say very quickly that there is a difference, I humbly think, between transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, right? And while interdisciplinarity can be a step towards transdisciplinarity, it also could not be, right? So I'm just kind of flagging that as one of the things that I want you to talk and think about. So for example, there are a lot of interdisciplinary things I'm sure that happen in One Health, right? So I'm sure that there's examples that you can give me where pathobiology might work with epidemiology. Thank you very much. Okay, that's very interdisciplinary, but it's not transdisciplinary. Like, you guys are over here still kind of talking the same language. Like, you still have a sense of what everybody is doing. Transdisciplinarity is absolutely beyond. It is beyond that. So if I had to describe it, I would say that it is an unbound movement between different types of knowledge-making systems, loyal to none, the willingness to embrace what works and to call out what doesn't, right? So there's a project that I'm doing right now, a book that I'm writing, and I'm not just holding up the Caribbean intellectual tradition and saying, oh my gosh, this is great, this is brilliant, insert my Trumpian voice here, like this is spectacular, right? No, I'm saying this tradition has given us very important analyses of certain things in the Caribbean, but it has also conflated some of the difficulties that we have to think about and talk about in the area that I'm writing about. And it's too far from this, so I'm not going to go into that. But it is this willingness to maneuver, to move, to have no place. You know what I mean? Which is like, you know, my mother has been telling me that from the time I was a little child. You're too out of place. Right? You don't have a place. You just figure it out. You run over here. You're doing something in pathobiology. It makes no sense. But you see something over here in, I don't know, anthropology. And it's like, let me put these two conversations together and see what happens, right? That's what I'm talking about. It's beyond interdisciplinarity. And I am going to suggest, and we'll see shortly in the Manufactured Ecosystems Project, hopefully, all of the problems that we have to fix in the world right now require, demand, that we stop working in these little silos and being comfortable in them, right? Coming up all the time with a piece of the answer. And I suggest a piece of the answer so small that it really doesn't change anything. It really doesn't influence anything, right? So this is me now, again, taking a step into a very out of place to tell you about the manufactured ecosystems. Dan, Andrea, feel free to jump in and rescue me as necessary, right? The Manufactured Ecosystems Project thinks and talks about our climate, where we are and where we will be if we do nothing about what is happening in our climate. And there is a most amazing team that is assembled under Professor Shoshana Jacobs, who is also a Teaching and Learning Fellow in the Office of Teaching and Learning. And they are approaching this problem from a number of perspectives. So there are scientists on the team, epidemiologists on the team, there is me on the team, we have theater arts on the team, and really I would say that these three questions that I've put here are kind of some of the keys upon which this transdisciplinary team turns. How do we create change in people? I promise you, that is not a question that science has the answer to at all. Back in the 90s, I was working with the National HIV/AIDS Commission in Barbados, right? Science doesn't have the answer to how to make people change. You can put condoms everywhere. You can give people all the information. You can tell them don't do this and this and this and this, and guess what? We still had an HIV pandemic, right? Science can make the strongest condoms, the best condoms, this. It doesn't change how people interact, use them, why they will use them, how they will not use them, whether they will multi-partner. Science doesn't have the answers for those things. So we need now other professionals who are thinking and studying along the lines of psychology, along the lines of organizational change, cultural change. When you have a conversation between the two, then maybe we will come up with a better answer. And I think that when you think about the HIV, pandemic, epidemic, I'm not sure which is the right word now, we weren't having that conversation at the beginning. And I think as we got better at those conversations, we were then able to make inroads and to make movements and to do things that people actually saw themselves reflected in, at least in the work that we did in Barbados, right? So it is not only a question too of what do we do now? How do we change the world now? How do we deal with climate now? As if everything has to change. For some communities and societies, it's actually how do we go back to what we used to do before, right? So I remember my granny in the Caribbean, we used to get these big old butter tots. And she would cut the top off, the tot, and we would paint the tot, and that was our plant pot. So that was recycling way before it was even a thing, right? So I can think, of course, not my story to tell, but I can think of the indigenous community and the way that they live. Take only what you need, right? These are things that will help our climate. So it's not even just how do we change as if nobody had knowledge before. Because that's one of the grand narratives that we tell in terms of knowledge hegemony. Nobody knows anything. Nobody knows anything. We have to go and we have to give knowledge to everybody. We have to civilize the world, right? So we're stepping back from that and we're saying, wait, hold on. There were people who were doing things before that were actually useful things. So sometimes it is, how do we preserve the old ways? How do we get people to think and talk about the old ways and understand the value of the old ways? And of course, we want to ask the question, how do we use science in a different way? Because science has been a very problematic discipline up to this point, if we are honest. It's been used for good, and it's been used for very, very, very bad. And I don't know, I'm sorry to do this, guys, but I have to do this. If you thought about Trump's victory speech last week, I'm sorry to take us there, but he was just ogling over Elon Musk and Elon Musk his quest to get to outer space. And he was talking about some rocket that Musk, and I was just like, this is so scary. This is really scary. And all of that is science. And with him at the helm of the United States, at the helm of, all of the technology that they have, the ability to do science, it is just scary to think about what Trump and Musk are going to be up to. So science is not neutral. It is not neutral. So a part of what we're doing in this project as well is asking ourselves, how can science become a service? How can science and people be more connected instead of, that distance that we had before between the experts and the rest of us, right? So my part in this project is actually really simple and really fun. The researchers do the research and I research them, right? So as they are doing all of the wonderful things and thinking about all of the wonderful things that they're doing, I am just there looking over their shoulders at how they're practicing this transdisciplinarity. What is working? What lessons can we take away? How can we embed that in knowledge so that people who want to practice transdisciplinarity have like a roadmap, right? So we know that universities have been described, like we said, as Western institutions. Some people would say that there are toxicities that are embedded. It's adversarial. Everybody has a research program, a research lab. Everybody wants their own students, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the questions that I am asking as I'm looking through the manufactured ecosystems team and some of the work that they're doing, can transdisciplinary teams change the way that we approach the university and how and what we do, in research agendas in the university, right? We're thinking and talking about who is doing transdisciplinary research. Where do these people come from? What are their own trajectories of study? Are we finding that certain particular types of people are drawn to transdisciplinary research? Are we seeing everybody represented on our team? What are we seeing? We don't want to ever create a nirvana. There's no nirvana. So we're also thinking and talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the team. What have we done right? What can we do better? Et cetera, et cetera. How is the university responding to transdisciplinary work? Because I'm sold, but I'm also not a belonger. So how is the university, in its traditional sense, thinking and talking about transdisciplinary research? And one of the questions I remember specifically, do you encourage your students to do transdisciplinary research? It's risky. It really is. And I will also say that there is a value to having a sound disciplinary grounding before you move into transdisciplinary research, right? Because I was a linguist, like I was that thing. I was clear. I could sit in the library and count oohs and ahs and zeros and da-da-da-da. I needed to do that, and I needed to understand that, and I needed to understand how knowledge is constructed to then ask myself, okay, how can I reconstruct it? How can I do it differently? But I don't think I could have done that if I didn't have some background, right? And so we want students to understand that. We want students to know that. And then we want you to bomb it and say, okay, here is how I can use that wonderful knowledge that I got from my discipline to now be more inclusive and to stretch. And can transdisciplinarity be a practice of equity, diversity, inclusion, indigenization, and accessibility? So in the way we build these teams, in how we ask the questions, in how we approach the research, can we actually be advancing the agenda of EDIA? So just to give you kind of a flavor of what we're finding, right? You can't be connected to being an expert if you want to practice transdisciplinarity. There's a humility that comes with it. It is also a research that is grounded in people, not just the people that we are researching, but also the people that we're doing the research with. The relationships are different, right? And the beauty about them being different is that they address some of those issues that we were talking about in terms of the toxicity and some of the ways that we see the university. So I think just coming out of this piece that I took from one of the interviews, we can see how the things that we think about and talk about as EDIA are embedded already in transdisciplinary practice, right? And then, is transdisciplinary research easy? Because there are some people that say, oh, you people that do that kind of work, you're not real. You're not real. Like, we're the real academics over here, the people who are inside our discipline, inside our box. You guys are just messing up the place. Like, is it easy? It is not easy. And like I said, it is a practice on top of a practice. You don't just come and decide, oh, I want to be transdisciplinary. No. You have to put it down on something. You have to know and understand how the system of knowledge making works. And then you can say, okay, well, I can see how this knowledge making and how it is working is not enough. And then you can ask yourself, okay, how can I add to it? So it is not easy. It is actually quite complicated. And I really liked this response as well because it shows the mindfulness that goes into the practice. How do I create, like I said before, a safe space, right? It is important to create safe space. But again, we see how it ties into EDIA because we're asking the same questions, we're asking them in different ways, right? We are breaking that dichotomy of who is researched and who is researching. Right? They're doing the research and I'm researching. Like, we have no, like, whatever. We don't, we don't need to do all of this. You on that side, I on that. Like, no. We can move through the process fluidly. And that is how we help to make the meaning, right? And focus groups. I really like that. Focus groups in science? Oh my goodness, like what? One time that was not research at all. Focus groups, like, do some quantitative stuff. What is going on? But we're changing those perspectives with transdisciplinary practice, and we're helping to see how doing that kind of work is very important. So one last slide before I shut up and turn over to you. I just wanted to talk a little bit about my transgressions, of which I'm very proud. So I still work with, I don't remember where they are, you know, medical doctors study really long, but they're actually doctors, and they're psychiatrists. And I do a seminar with them on domestic violence from the perspective of mental health, from the perspective of living in a plantation society, from the perspective of the colonial relic, right? And I take them through all kinds of things that they will need to think about and talk about if they want to show up as different inside of a health system that is very complicated, right? Let's say complicated. Like, I was going to say broken, but let's be nice. Let's just say complicated, right? And I encourage them to think about, there's that word again, the meta theory. Why are we doing things the way we are doing them? If there is one answer that drives me crazy, I was telling Sarah this the other day. Oh, well, that's just how it is. Why is it that way? Can somebody tell me why? Right? So I encourage them to think about that, right? When you're serving the public, don't just tell me what you can't do. Tell me how you can look at this problem and see something that you can do, because somebody's life depends on it, right? When you have a woman who's left a situation of domestic violence, you are the one that stands between her and the court, and the report that you write is important. Don't tell me what you can do. Tell me what you can do, right? So yes, like I said, I lean a lot on plantation and plantation theory, but the thing that I love the most is that these doctors get to learn something more than doctoring, which is important if they're going to offer services to a community outside of the classroom. It is very important, right? And then I've also done a module in medical communication where I'm thinking about how different speech communities access medical knowledge differently, right? And you might think, but that is not relevant, because one of the examples I used to use is this thing about take a teaspoon of something. That means nothing to a person from the Caribbean, I will tell you, right? Like, a spoon is a spoon is a spoon. And I mean, like, I am an educated person, and I promise you, do not tell me take a teaspoon of something, because whatever spoon of that. Furthermore, I can just gauge it. I can just put the bottle to my head and I can gauge it. And that is a cultural, that is a deeply ingrained cultural reality, right? So we talk about all kinds of things in the medical practice and how belonging to a particular community can change meaning. And so then how do you communicate so that you can actually get people to do what you want them to do? Now, if you give me one of those things with the bulb at the top, I don't remember what that's called.
Dropper?
A dropper. Thank you very much. I will use that because that is fancy. So I will use that, right? But a spoon, I am not digging around in no kitchen to find no teaspoon table. But a dropper I will use, because that's like, ooh, right? So all bodies are not just bodies. People have their little nuances, their little things that they come to the health sphere with. And if we're going to serve them, we have to think about those things. And then finally, I always like to leave people with more. Where can I find more? So CLR James, in Beyond the Boundary, talks a lot about, again, transdisciplinary research, his experience with it, the experience of living in a part of the world that isn't the center. How do you make knowledge and understanding from that place? It's very good for that. Dear Science and Other Stories, McKittrick is talking about the knowledge-making enterprise. Who do we cite? How do we, through just a citation that we choose, how do we disrupt knowledge hegemony? Why are we citing who we are citing, right? And I'm gonna develop a resource shortly to help profs who want to embed information beyond the Western tradition. Like, I'm just gonna do like a flow chart to say, okay, you've got XYZ person in your course, then a box that says, okay, who else is talking about this from a different intellect, just a simple set of steps that if you follow those, you can actually, you know, change up and improve just looking at one particular intellectual tradition. And then just because we're talking about health today, I also wanted to show as well that, you know, Caribbean people are encapsulating their own experiences of the health system, the nexus and intersections between medicine, science, and folk, and culture, and that kind of thing. And that is the beauty of transdisciplinarity. You just get to cycle amount in between all of those ideas and find what works for you. I really don't like to talk at people. I want to talk with people, so I want to shut up so that we can get to some questions. Thank you very much.